These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But Israel, the Israelites, were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in number, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Those are the opening words to the second book in the Bible. The first 6 verses of the 51st chapter in the Torah. And when this begins, you begin to see the stage to a great drama unfolding. Back in the day, I was in a couple of musicals. One of the musicals I was in, I played Nathan in Guys and Dolls. I was pretty excited about it because I got to play Frank Sinatra's character. But as I remember standing backstage. You're good. I remember being backstage. And it was a lot like that. You're backstage waiting, and you're nervous, and you're anxious, and then you await to hear the opening number. The overture is ramping up, and all of your nerves are there, and you're ready, and the curtain peels back, and there are people going this way and that. They're running back and forth. Fake streets of the Big Apple are behind you, and you see people dressed like it's the 1950s, and they're dancing, and they're going back and forth. You have choreographers splitting stage left as a couple walks off stage right in their beautiful suits and dresses, and the scene is set. Within that first few seconds of that musical, you know where you're at. You know when you're at. You have an expectation of what's going to happen over the next few hours. The audience has been prepared for what the vibe of the production will be. And now the musical can begin and the drama can unfold. Moses does the same thing. There is no background music. There is no overture happening. But in those first 6 verses, you can see the drama unfolding as Moses sets the stage for one of Earth's most dramatic, pivotal, and foundational stories. This story of Exodus is the birth of the Jewish people. This is the most formative narrative in the Old Testament, which defines Israel's identity as the people redeemed from Egypt. This book of Exodus serves as a covenantal roadmap for how God relates to his people. It's a story that establishes God as the supreme and authoritative deity above all other gods. This book serves as a testament to God's faithfulness and his remembrances of his promises that were made to the patriarchs. Exodus serves as a story of resilience in the face of insurmountable adversity. It's an epic tale of God's miraculous power. It's a story of testing and trusting in God's providence. It is a journey from wilderness of transformation to a promised land of abundance. Here's what I want you to see early on as we begin this sermon series drawn out through the book of Exodus. It is this: it would be nearly impossible to overstate the importance of this book. This is the first historical record of how God redeemed his people from slavery in Egypt. And this book defines Israel's identity. And it also tells us this: that God remembers his promises, God rescues his people, God triumphs over the so-called gods of Egypt. But it's more than history. It's a revelation of the fact of how God works in the world, his triumph of good over evil, of the living God over idols, and of covenant faithfulness over oppression. And even more than that, it is all of those things. But this story is also an archetype for us. Exodus is not only about Israel back then, it is about us now. You and I, we may not face a Pharaoh. There may not be someone standing there in a big hat, standing there and saying no. But we do face powers that enslave us. We are hemmed in by the pressures of the world and by the sin that weighs us down and by the adversary who would keep us chained. And yet, the good news is that in Christ, which is the greater Moses, God is drawing each and every one of us out. We are also being drawn out. Out of our old selves into the new selves, out of bondage and into freedom, out of death and into life, out of the grave and out of the tomb and into the garden. We are being drawn out by God. And so Exodus gives us a pattern, a lens for seeing the seasons of our own lives. It reminds us that God is still the one who redeems, still the one who confronts the false gods of our age. God is still the one who leads his people through wilderness and into promise. In all of that drama, all that that book stands for, all that this book will talk about, begins by connecting to the one directly before it, which in so doing connects this book back to the patriarchs, the fathers of Israel. So, to get where we're going, we need to know where we have come from. See, because as commentary writer Tremper Logman said, without a doubt, Genesis is an important book, providing the foundation to much that follows. Genesis deserves close study. But that said, in its cultural context, it is the preface to the book of Exodus. He goes on and says this. Genesis provides the background to prepare the reader for hearing the story of Exodus. And it's because of this that I want to give a very quick, truncated, not doing enough justice, not spending enough time on the 50 chapters that make up the book of Genesis. I want to focus on chapters 12 through 50, and I'm going to run through it real fast. Many of these stories you have heard or taught in Sunday school or at VBS. But I want to give you a quick reminder of some of the events that happen in Genesis that gets us to Egypt and who this Joseph character was that was referenced in verse 6. So in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham is called by God and is promised descendants and a land that will be shown to him. Abraham in Genesis 16 has a child named Ishmael, but it wasn't with his wife. Then in Genesis 21, at the ripe old age of 100, Abraham has Isaac. It's hard for Isaac to have anyone when he's not been born yet. Then Isaac has twins, Esau and Jacob. Esau is a hairy one. He's the firstborn. Jacob is a conniver, and he grabs onto the ankle of Esau at everything he does, basically. And so Jacob then steals the birthright from his brother Esau over a bowl of soup. It's quite the story. Then Jacob goes away, and he's on his way back to meet with his brother. The night before, he has a wrestling match with God, and he is renamed Israel, he who wrestles with God, in Genesis 32. We get an account of the sons of Jacob in Genesis 35, and he has 12 of them: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. If you're looking for names for your future children, look no further. There aren't a lot of Gads being made these days. I don't think we still make them. Joseph is Jacob's favorite son, who was born in Jacob's old age. Joseph gets special treatment, and his brothers begin to get jealous of him and his technicolored coat. And then Joseph has the audacity to have prophetic dreams and then tell his brothers they're going to bow down to him, which they love, I'm sure. Psych. They actually decide, we're going to kill this kid because we're sick and tired of him. And then the older brother goes, hold on, guys. What if instead of killing the guy, we got some money out of this whole deal? So they sold him into slavery. So then Joseph finds himself in Egypt as a slave to Potiphar. Some crazy things go down there, as you know. Lands Joseph in prison. But no matter what Joseph does, no matter where he is at, he flourishes. Things go well for him. But people don't always receive that well where he is at, which, like I said, lands him in prison. Joshua experiences God's grace in all that he does. God extends that promise that he made to Abraham on through the bloodline and into Joseph. And that is why when Joseph is in prison, there are two men there that he interprets dreams for. They are then sent out from that prison. 2 years go by. Joseph is still sitting in the jail cell forgotten until in a dark hour of the Pharaoh, Joseph is remembered. Joseph then comes to the Pharaoh and interprets the dream. It is that dream that predicts that there will be a drought and famine in 7 years after 7 years of abundance. Because of Joseph, how he is and how he works and how he operates, and mainly because of God's grace and his mercy working through him, Joseph is put in charge of the storehouses and eventually becomes the second in command in all of Egypt. A foreigner, second in command. Joseph saves them from the drought. For 7 years, he gathers grain and gathers things so that the people would not starve in the coming drought and famine. Then the drought and famine comes. Egypt is prepared. Everywhere else is not. So not only did Joseph save Egypt, it also tells us in the Bible that the nations around came to Egypt for the crop to be saved. They came to Egypt to receive food and nourishment, which means that Egypt gained power and prowess because of Joseph, because of God's promise to him. You seeing this? There's also a land that was affected by that was inhabited by a guy named Jacob and his 11 sons. They're also hungry, so they go and look for food, and they end up, unbeknownst to them, at Joseph's feet in Egypt, at the second in control. And here stands this Egyptian-looking man who plays some tricks on them. And then what happens? Eventually, Joseph reveals himself, and he saves Jacob and his whole family. And God's people are saved from famine and from drought because of Joseph's life. Does this all sound familiar to you? If you want to know more, open the book of Genesis. It is a beautiful one. It is an amazing book. And it serves as the prequel to where we are headed now. With the opening of the book of Exodus, Moses has set us and the original audience on the beginning of a journey. But we really find out that we're in the middle of a journey that started hundreds of years prior to the stories and the happenings in Exodus. And what those first 6 verses do is that they call you to remember what happened in the first one because you're in the sequel. And Moses is trying to tell us in those 6 verses, and what we're going to talk about today is this. Don't forget Joseph, and don't forget God. Do not forget Joseph, and do not forget God. Because as every drama unfolds, and as this drama unfolds, it unfolds with twists and turns. If nothing ever happened, why would you read the book? And so something happens, and this book begins with a twist. Let us begin reading again here in verse 7 of Exodus chapter 1. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies. Fight against us and leave this country." So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for the Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter. All their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. Up to this point, the Israelites were flourishing, exceedingly fruitful, and multiplied greatly. This serves as a continuation of God's promise in Genesis and the promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this is a promise that is happening even in the midst of exile and in the midst of persecution, in the midst of being in a foreign land. God is still bringing his promises to pass. Verse 8 serves as the record scratch moment. This is the time where it hinges and everything changes. This is what happens in verse 8. We see the stakes of the drama have come. Our villain has been revealed. And God's people are no longer sovereign, but they are subjugated. And it is out of Pharaoh's fear that the Egyptians oppress the people. Pressing the people that God has chosen to bring forth his redemptive plan. Everything that follows forth in this book pours forth from that fear and from that forgetfulness. The oppression that comes, the slavery that comes, the cry for deliverance, it all hangs on the shift of the Pharaoh forgetting the past, forgetting Joseph, forgetting what God had done for his people, and how it led to where they are in this moment. The most dangerous words in all of Scripture might be verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. See, earlier I said that this book is both a historical account and an archetype. Verse 8 is a perfect example of this. Jewish scholars consider this to be one of the most important verses in the entire Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, the law. For Jewish readers, verse 8 is more than history. It is a pattern. It reminds them that the exile and persecution often begins when a culture forgets its benefactors. When powers turn suspicious of God's people. Egypt forgetting Joseph becomes the archetype for every later exile. Babylon, Persia, and Rome. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, another good name for today, if you're adding it to your baby list, he puts it this way. The exodus from Egypt occurs not only once in history, but in every human heart, in every generation. See, that is why verse 8 speaks powerfully not only about the truth that the Pharaoh forgot Joseph, the actual man, but it also serves for us powerfully spiritually, because it warns what happens when we forget the Lord's deliverance, when we forget from whence we came. When the memory of God's faithfulness fades, bondage is never far behind. Every single generation must remember Joseph, and every generation must remember God, or they risk repeating Egypt's descent. Don't forget Joseph. Don't forget God. The fallout of Exodus, the pain, the suffering, the oppression that will come in the following chapters hinge on memory. Pharaoh forgot, but God remembers. Chapters 1 and 2, we'll get to chapter 2 next week and some of chapter 1, serve as an opening scene to this book. This section ends in chapter 2, verses 24 through 25. I'm going to read the NLT translation, but go ahead and look at this. This is what it says. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. God remembered, God heard, and God knew when to act. This is so important. God does not forget. God sees and God hears. God knows his promises, and God in his wisdom knew when to act. And it was to this end that David Nicholas reminds us, God's promises are like the stars. The darker the night, the brighter they shine. Here's what I want you to think about. I want you to imagine with me, go down an imaginary road with me. You know nothing about the Bible. You know nothing about God, except for what we read here today. What would we know about God? One of the things that's interesting about the book of Exodus, it isn't unique in Scripture, but it is a unique thing in our world, that the way it treats God is as an actual character in the story. And we are being revealed facts about this character, the supreme character in the story of Exodus. What would we know? What would we know about this God? Well, in the last verses I just read, we were told that God hears and he remembers. We've been told that God has a covenant promise with a certain people group, that God looks down and that he knows and has wisdom of when is the appropriate time to do things and to not do things. Those are the things explicitly stated in these verses that we have today. There are things that are not so explicitly stated here that we will get to next week. So if you want to know those things, I'll see you in 7 days. But what I want you to know is if those things are true about God, and they are, what does that mean for you today? It means that you should not forget Joseph and that you should not forget God. I've been getting to know many of you. I have known you for many years. I don't know what it is about this moment that we're living in. But there is just something about the moment, and I'm not talking cultural moment. I'm talking about the time in your individual actual lives. I've never known a group of people who have all been going through it. In a different way or another, every single person in here, whether it's themselves, whether it's their family members, whether it's someone very dear to them in their lives, are going through it, are going through real life struggles. It is sickness. It is pain. It is addiction. It is loss. It is grief. It is turmoil. And my heart goes out to each and every one of us that know people in our lives that are hurting, that we ourselves are hurting. And I also want you to know that my heart goes out to you if it seems like in this moment God is silent. If it feels like God is silent right now, like your prayers aren't working, do not forget Joseph and do not forget God. Remember that God's promises shine brightest in the darkest night. So do not give up on prayer. Do not give up on God because he has the wisdom to know when to act. Will you trust him? And also, one of the things for us to know in this season of hurt and pain is that we serve a faithful God. We serve a faithful God, and one that does not change. I don't know if you're like me, but I suffer sometimes from spiritual amnesia, spiritual short-term memory loss. I forget what God has done for me in the past. I forget what God has done. And some of us may find ourselves in a cycle and a repetition that we're in this season that feels a lot like one we had a few years ago. But we forget what God did back then. We forget how God provided back then. And so it's hard for us to stand now, and we find ourselves fighting the same battles we fought back then. When back then God proved faithful, God saw you through, God got you through it. And He can do it again. The whole reason that God's people were in Egypt at all was because God was faithful to His promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those promises that extended to Joseph, that God then poured out forth through Joseph to Egypt for Egypt's common good, but ultimately for the good of Joseph's father. Because if God hadn't been faithful to Joseph, then Egypt couldn't have welcomed Jacob and his 70 family members to be saved from the drought and famine. But that did not come without its own costs. Joseph had to go through it. We will see in the book of Exodus that yes, God will save the people of Israel, but His servant Moses will go through it. And so will the people of Egypt go through it. You need to know that. But I want you to think about Joseph. It did not come easy. For God's plan to work, a drought that would come many years in the future, it meant that Joseph needed to be sold into slavery. And it meant that Joseph needed to be landed in prison. And it meant that Joseph needed to stay in prison for 2 years. And it meant that Joseph needed to go and serve a Pharaoh. And then it meant that Joseph had to go and bless a nation that wasn't his own. And it meant that Joseph then had to forgive his family members who sold him into slavery. And it meant that he had to be faithful to the dream. And it meant that God had to be faithful through all of it, even though that entire time it looks like God's not being faithful. But He was faithful to Joseph. He's going to be faithful to Moses. He's going to be faithful to Joshua. He's going to be faithful to Samuel. He's going to be faithful to David. He's going to be faithful to Jesus. He's going to be faithful to you today. And so wherever you find yourself at today, God is faithful, and He will see you through because our God is the same yesterday, today, now, and forever. The question is, will you let Him in? Will you let Him do it? For He stands at the door, and He knocks. If you will open the door and welcome Him in, He will come and dine with you. That is Jesus' invitation to the spiritual sojourner, the ones wandering in the desert. That He will come and He will dine with you. That is a promise. That is a promise. So if you feel like you're in a spiritual desert, that invitation is for you. Right here, right now, in this moment. Not when you have it all figured out. Not when the storm clears. Not when the ground gets firm again. But right now. And God's promise is that if you open the door, He will come and dwell with you. Theologian N.T. Wright puts it this way: the Exodus is not complete until God dwells with His people. Would you open the door? Would you let Him in? Would you dwell with Him and dine with the Savior who is faithful yesterday, now, and always? Because the Exodus you are going through will not be complete until God's people dwell with Him. Pray with me.